Over 10 Hezbollah members were killed and over 3,000 injured when pagers used by them suddenly exploded after overheating yesterday. Now, reports indicate that Israeli Spy Agency Mossad apparently used PETN to trigger the pager blasts in Lebanon to target Hezbollah by overheating batteries from afar. Mossad got hold of Hezbollah's communication devices before they were handed over to the terror group 5 months ago. The Israeli intelligence hid explosive material inside a batch of pagers that Hezbollah ordered from the Taiwanese company, according to the New York Times, citing US and other officials. The New York Times report says that Hezbollah had ordered 5,000 pagers from a Taiwanese company, Gold Apollo, but they had been tampered with before reaching Lebanon. Gold Apollo, however, has denounced and said that these charges are wrong and that the devices used in the blast were actually from a European company called BAC, which has a license to use the Taiwanese firm's brand name and is based in Hungary. Now, this brings us to the questions that we are asking here on the News 9 Plus show today. Is Israel behind the pager blasts in Lebanon? Is this a major strategic blow to Iran and its proxies in the region? And could this event further escalate the situation in the Middle East? Joining me to discuss this is Itai Melchior, Middle East expert and former executive of the Israeli National Security Council. We also have Jiten Jain, cybersecurity expert, joining us on the show. Itai, thank you very much for being here. Aditya, this side. What are your first comments on this, what you saw yesterday? You know, I've been chatting with a lot of my colleagues here, and you know, we were really shocked with the visuals that were coming in. I mean, nobody had expected this kind of an attack really taking place. Of course, we don't know who is behind this, but all guns are now blazing towards Israel. What are your reaction? And perhaps also if you could analyze what could be the implications, the immediate implications of this.
My first reaction was actually to try and explain to the younger generation what a pager is, because most of your viewers don't even know what a pager is. The ones of us a bit older remember what it is, and then you have to think, why is Hezbollah using those pagers? So
Right.
of course today, with the world of intelligence, where cell phones are vulnerable, the mean of communication go back and back. We know that Sinwar in the tunnels under Gaza is using couriers and messengers, and the only way that Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon can communicate is by getting messages on the different pager devices, and then they get their instructions or orders to call someone on a landline or whatever. So the first thing to remember is why what the benefits are of attacking these pagers. Now, of course, there's a huge number of casualties at different levels, but the main benefit here is that it hinders communication and in essence actually forces Hezbollah to go back to the more modern ways of communication, and they know that these ways of communication are much more vulnerable for interception and other technologies that can be used, and that is actually in a way flushing out Hezbollah. So that is my first reaction, to understand that this is not only aimed at targeting the terrorists themselves, but also creating chaos in the communication and flushing them out to means which are easier for Western groups to be able to see what's going on. So that is the first thing. The second thing is just to go back and remember what Hezbollah actually is.
Right.
Hezbollah is an Iran proxy sitting in Lebanon. They are trying to inflict damage on Israel, but in doing so have inflicted much more damage in Lebanon itself. Lebanon is in a terrible economic state, and I think that there are growing voices in Lebanon calling for Hezbollah to become a lesser power in Lebanon. I think this is also maybe behind the question you will probably ask me next: how is Hezbollah going to retaliate? Are we going for a full-out war between Israel and Hezbollah?
Fair enough. Itai, I'll come back to you to understand what happened to that Iran's reaction that we have been waiting for weeks together. And, you know, was this also a message, you know, to Iran and also to perhaps delay that response? But Jiten, as someone who has dealt with the security apparatus at different levels, you also dealt with the cyber security in many ways. I have a two-part question for you. One, Of course, how did you see this kind of an attack? Had you ever yourself imagined that this kind of a pager blast could happen simultaneously, 3 to 5,000 pagers, blasting? And secondly, from the Indian context, there are a lot of foreign softwares working in India. Of course, we have banned many softwares as well. But what are the security implications for India? Would we have to go to the drawing board and perhaps analyze and see what kind of steps we need to take so that this doesn't happen here or elsewhere in our neighborhood?
To your first question, would anybody would have imagined 5,000 pagers?
Right.
They avoided a war by weaponizing a technology. But that's not the beauty of it, Aditya. Aditya, the beauty is they spent 10 years in research along with US in 3 successive governments without any hindrance, multiple changes of regimes, and they spent 10 years in developing that malware. They spent multiple years and decades of research to develop automated weapons using AI and remote commands, enabled guns to assassinate Iranian generals and scientists. Nobody would have ever thought that a car, somebody in a car would fire a bullet sitting back in Tel Aviv and assassinate a guy with a pinpoint precision. But that's what happened. This is what Israel brings on the table. Unbelievable, weaponization of technology innovation, and then using it in the real-time scenarios. Now, for these pages to go off, the first reaction of the world was, what have they done? Have they hacked some pager and made the circuit blast itself? It was only 24 hours later people realized that it was a beautiful combination of supply chain infection, deployment of technology to trigger the remote triggering of explosives, and then planting 20-gram explosives. But to do that, you would have had taken years of intelligence to figure out how Hezbollah was operating away from cell phones, shifting back to those old age pagers, then to figure out the supply chains, the company which was supplying it, then the original equipment manufacturer in Hungary, Budapest, then to intercept that shipment, being able to infiltrate those companies' resources which would have helped you to plant explosives and disguise of electronical circuit on that device on that circuit. And then the technology to trigger those blasts by using a beep or a pager or a SMS.
Right.
All 3 things had to go together: the planting of explosives, the intelligence of supply chain, and then the hacking or the cyber deployment of technology to trigger the blast. And this is what Israel brings on the table. And unbelievable innovation, which you could have never even imagined. But that brings us to 3 questions. What lessons can we learn? A, India's dependency on foreign supply chains, especially on China in telecom electronics sector, is so much that we today have, the rough assessment says that 60% of our critical gadgetry either comes directly from China or those, different routing of Singapore, Thailand,
that's right,
by relabeling companies and then supplying Chinese gadgetry. Now, suppose if China as a state tomorrow wanted to infect the supply chain, which they have done it in the past, they have infected machines to, hack into data centers of Amazon. There have been allegations to steal patents of, different US critical companies. So China has been, as a state, has been notoriously famous for, weaponizing the supply chains, trying to hack into systems. So tomorrow, if China were to plant explosive in the mobile phones which they've been supplying to India, or the PCs or circuits, or even the Arduino boards, you can only imagine the scenario, and that too with in a era where 60% of our connectivity is also dependent on their gadgetry in our telecom sector. So I think the best lesson for us here is, the most critical important lesson is that we must reduce our dependence on Chinese supply chains in the electronic gadgetry. Lesson number 2, we should not try and copy what somebody else has done. Look at the original innovation here. Aditya, I can tell you, nobody, if you speak to 1,000 technical experts, nobody will tell you that they would have even imagined in their dreams that 1,000 pagers can be used as a bomb together. Right. This is what the real innovation is. And these are one small countries with a population of not even 1% of Indian size, bringing so much on the table. And we, which is called a cyber, outsourcing superpower or software superpower, we are not able to repurpose that force into cyber offensive superpower in the world. And this is where the opportunity is. If we are able to repurpose or reposition and reskill our force to become an offensive cyber superpower, I think that will give us a window of edge, a very limited window to take on China.
But absolutely a larger lesson there for India and perhaps the entire globe to realize the consequences of technology as well. We were surprised on 7th October with the newest kind of terror attack from sea, from water, and from air. But this time around, using technology in such a precision manner is certainly unbelievable. But Itai, you were speaking...
That repairs the Mossad.
Yeah.
That repairs the Mossad's image, which was dented on 7th of October.
Absolutely.
The assassination of Hamas commander in Iran, nobody even noted whether it was an airborne projectile, it was a missile, or was it a planted explosive many months ago?
Yeah.
But this is what Israel is. This is what they do. That you can't even imagine, even with the retrospective intelligence, that what they have actually done.
Yeah, that's true. Itai, you were speaking about pagers and telling the younger generation what pagers really were. I just recollected that what was my experience. I remember that my uncle was in the Indian intelligence, and in the early 90s, or perhaps it was mid 90s, and I was really young, and he actually showed me the first pager out there. And for fun, he was sitting in his intelligence office, and I used to make phone calls and send him messages out there. But yeah, that was my first brush with pagers. But from pagers to the larger scenario of an Iranian response to the killing that have happened in Tehran. How do you see this shape up? Of course, there's been a lot of US pressure and pressure from other countries to de-escalate tensions in the region. But do you think the Iranians are also now trying to de-escalate this, or are they waiting for the right opportunity to use their proxies?
Well, first of all, everybody's waiting for the US elections to happen.
True.
So everybody's holding their breath on all sides. I have heard rumors that this was not the date Israel had chosen for this attack or the point in time, but somehow there were suspicions about these pagers, and therefore they had to activate it before the pagers were discarded. So I don't know about that, but for sure, everybody's waiting. At the end of the month, we have the UN General Assembly in New York, where all the leaders want to be. I don't think Netanyahu wants any full-out war before that. He wants to go to New York and then have meetings in Washington, as do other leaders. So therefore, let's wait and see about that. Iran does not have to revenge this action, which is aimed at terrorists in Lebanon, even though it's a proxy. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of pressure on Nasrallah not to wage war, even though Iran is putting a lot of positive pressure. He has local pressure against. And tomorrow afternoon, he will address the public, and then we will get a better insight of his intentions. I do want to touch on a very important topic that the other expert mentioned, and you asked about the cyber. In my other hat, I'm invested in a few cyber companies, and you have to understand that while your computers have different defense mechanisms on them, equipment traditionally doesn't, because equipment does not have an operating system where you can run an antivirus, and it is comprised of many different kinds of equipment and protocols. So if you go to your infrastructure, to your water companies, utilities, energy, you will see a lot of vulnerabilities. Just last week in the US, it was discovered that cranes in their ports, which were made in China, had Chinese backdoors in them, transmitting back to China. So the big question is actually, how do you protect your infrastructure, your OT equipment? Because as you rightfully mentioned, this attack is similar to the attack that the Stuxnet attack against the centrifuges in the nuclear facilities in Iran. It's the same kind of attack in which you actually hinder the operations. You tamper with operations. You can either get them to spin faster, you can get them to overheat. Remember, if your phone today overheats, it'll just switch itself off. All the smartphones, if they overheat, if you leave it in the sun, you will see it will switch off, or some functionality will be lost. So again, if you tamper with that, then you are able to get to these extreme results. So there's a lot of similarity when attacking pieces of equipment, which are much more vulnerable than your regular IT systems are.
Well, surely Hezbollah is in a catch-22 right now. Do they use iPhones, the American iPhones, where of course, it can be detected, and on the other hand, we have saw what the pagers are up to these days. But Jiten, you have a response. But also, Jiten, what I also want to understand from you is that, we speak about Make in India. We speak about indigenization of, a lot of equipment, technology, cyber, etc. But are we there? Are we on the right path? Or do you think, as an expert, that there's so much more that needs to be done?
On a lighter note, I think it's time for Hezbollah to shift back to pigeons, because everything else Israelis will intercept. And it's time for India to start gifting iPhone 15 or 16 to Khalistanis and Jaish-e-Mohammed.
True that.
Now, on a serious issue, I think, when we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat and, I think we must be very, very, clear that assembled in India is not made in India.
Right.
Assembled in India is good for our economy, good for our, at-risk technology transfers, good for bringing self-reliance on supply chains. But if you really want to have self-reliant innovations, if you really want to build a Atmanirbhar, technologically Atmanirbhar Bharat, then it must be made in India, not assembled in India. And this is what the problem is. So many of the, this camera companies or, gadgetry companies, even the toys which have been claiming to made in India products, 80% of them have been, just sourcing hardware from China by relabeling and rerouting the supply routes to Thailand, Dubai, Singapore, and then bringing it to India, assembling it, and then putting a label of made in India. That's the whole problem. I think that we must identify the critical equipments in any gadgetry,
right,
and then ask original equipment manufacturing origin or the source of supply or the source of manufacturing, the original places, and then decide what, quantum of, assembling we allow, and then to be labeled a product as a made in India or assembled in India.
Well, certainly we haven't heard the last of what will happen to these pagers really now, and what really led to this. Perhaps now, not now, but perhaps months from now, there would be some investigation to really reveal how this really happened.
Maybe
perhaps we'll see a Netflix series on it.
I think any terrorist group, using pagers today would be dumping them down in some dustbin. So I think the pager prices are certainly going
Absolutely. Down. This is the death of the pagers, unfortunately, if it hadn't happened earlier. But Itai and Jiten Jain, thank you very much for joining us with very, very important, valuable insights on how things have been unfolding after the pager blasts in Lebanon. Thank you for joining us.